Chapter 3 The Dignified Mr. Carmyle 1. By 6 o'clock on the following evening, however, Sally had been forced to the conclusion that Ginger would have to struggle through life as best he could without the assistance of her contemplated remarks, for she had seen nothing of him all day, and in another hour she would have left Roville on the 7:15 express which was to take her to Paris, en route for Cherbourg, and the liner whereon she had booked her passage for New York. It was in the faint hope of finding him even now that, at 6:30, having conveyed her baggage to the station and left it in charge of an amiable porter, she paid a last visit to the Casino Municipal. She disliked the thought of leaving Ginger without having uplifted him. Like so many alert and active-minded girls, she possessed in a great degree the quality of interesting herself in, or, as her brother Fillmore preferred to put it, messing about with, the private affairs of others. Ginger had impressed her as a man to whom it was worth while to give a friendly shove on the right path, and it was with much gratification, therefore, that, having entered the casino, she perceived a flaming head shining through the crowd which had gathered at one of the roulette tables. There are two casinos at Roville-sur-Mer. The one on the promenade goes in mostly for sea air and a mild game called boule. It is the big Casino Municipal down in the Palace Masséna near the railway station, which is the haunt of the earnest gambler who means business, and it was plain to Sally directly she arrived that Ginger Kemp not only meant business, but was getting results. Ginger was going extremely strong. He was entrenched behind an opulent-looking mound of square counters, and, even as Sally looked, a wooden-faced croupier shoved a further instalment across the table to him at the end of his long rake. "Épatant," murmured a wistful man at Sally's side, removing an elbow from her ribs, in order the better to gesticulate. Sally, though no French scholar, gathered that he was startled and gratified. The entire crowd seemed to be startled and gratified. There is undoubtedly a certain altruism in the make-up of the spectators at a continental roulette table. They seem to derive a spiritual pleasure from seeing somebody else win. The croupier gave his moustache a twist with his left hand, and the wheel a twist with his right, and silence fell again. Sally, who had shifted to a spot where the pressure of the crowd was less acute, was now able to see Ginger's face, and as she saw it she gave an involuntary laugh. He looked exactly like a dog at a rat-hole. His hair seemed to bristle with excitement. One could almost fancy that his ears were pricked up. In the tense hush which had fallen on the crowd at the restarting of the wheel, Sally's laugh rang out with an embarrassing clearness. It had a marked effect on all those within hearing. There is something almost of religious ecstasy in the deportment of the spectators at a table where anyone is having a run of luck at roulette, and if she had guffawed in a cathedral, she could not have caused a more pained consternation. The earnest worshippers gazed at her with shocked eyes, and Ginger, turning with a start, saw her and jumped up. As he did so, the ball fell with a rattling click into a red compartment of the wheel, and, as it ceased to revolve and it was seen that at last the big winner had picked the wrong colour, a shuddering groan ran through the congregation, like that which convulses the penitents' bench at a Negro revival meeting. More glances of reproach were cast at Sally. It was generally felt that her injudicious behaviour had changed Ginger's luck. The only person who did not appear to be concerned was Ginger himself. He gathered up his loot, thrust it into his pocket, and elbowed his way to where Sally stood, now definitely established in the eyes of the crowd as a pariah. There was universal regret that he had decided to call it a day. It was, to the spectators, as though a star had suddenly walked off the stage in the middle of his big scene, and not even a loud and violent quarrel which sprang up at this moment between two excitable gamblers over a disputed 5-franc counter could wholly console them. "I say," said Ginger, dexterously plucking Sally out of the crowd. "This is topping, meeting you like this. I've been looking for you everywhere." "It's funny you didn't find me then, for that's where I've been. I was looking for you." "No, really?" Ginger seemed pleased. He led the way to the quiet ante-room outside the gambling hall, and they sat down in a corner. It was pleasant here, with nobody near except the gorgeously uniformed attendant over by the door. "That was awfully good of you." "I felt I must have a talk with you before my train went." Ginger started violently. "Your train? What do you mean?" "The Puff-Puff," explained Sally. "I'm leaving tonight, you know." "Leaving?" Ginger looked as horrified as the devoutest of the congregation of which Sally had just ceased to be a member. "You don't mean leaving? You're not going away from Roville?" "I'm afraid so." "But why? Where are you going?" "Back to America. My boat sails from Cherbourg tomorrow." "Oh, my aunt!" "I'm sorry," said Sally, touched by his concern. She was a warm-hearted girl, and liked being appreciated. "But—" "I say!" Ginger Kemp turned bright scarlet and glared before him at the uniformed official, who was regarding their tête-à-tête with the indulgent eye of one who has been through this sort of thing himself. "I say! Look here! Will you marry me?" 2. Sally stared at his vermilion profile in frank amazement. Ginger, she had realized by this time, was in many ways a surprising young man, but she had not expected him to be as surprising as this. "Marry you?" "You know what I mean." "Well, yes, I suppose I do. You allude to the Holy State. Yes, I know what you mean." "Then how about it?" Sally began to regain her composure. Her sense of humour was tickled. She looked at Ginger gravely. He did not meet her eye, but continued to drink in the uniformed official, who was by now so carried away by the romance of it all that he had begun to hum a love ballad under his breath. The official could not hear what they were saying, and would not have been able to understand it even if he could have heard, but he was an expert in the language of the eyes. "But isn't this—don't think I am trying to make difficulties—isn't this a little sudden?" "It's got to be sudden," said Ginger Kemp complainingly. "I thought you were going to be here for weeks." "But, my infant, my babe, has it occurred to you that we are practically strangers?" She patted his hand tolerantly, causing the uniformed official to heave a tender sigh. "I see what has happened," she said. "You're mistaking me for some other girl, some girl you know really well and were properly introduced to. Take a good look at me, and you'll see." "If I take a good look at you," said Ginger feverishly, "I'm dashed if I'll answer for the consequences." And this is the man I was going to lecture on enterprise. "You're the most wonderful girl I've ever met, dash it," said Ginger, his gaze still riveted on the official by the door. "I dare say it is sudden. I can't help that. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, and there you are." "But—" "Now look here. I know I'm not much of a chap and all that, but, well, I've just won the deuce of a lot of money in there." "Would you buy me with your gold?" "I mean to say, we should have enough to start on, and, of course, I've made an infernal hash of everything I've tried up till now, but there must be something I can do, and you can jolly well bet I'd have a goodish stab at it. I mean to say, with you to buck me up and so forth, don't you know? Well, I mean—" "Has it struck you that I may already be engaged to someone else?" "Oh, golly! Are you?" For the first time he turned and faced her, and there was a look in his eyes which touched Sally and drove all sense of the ludicrous out of her. Absurd as it was, this man was really serious. "Well, yes, as a matter of fact I am," she said soberly. Ginger Kemp bit his lip, and for a moment was silent. "Oh, well, that's torn it," he said at last. Sally was aware of an emotion too complex to analyze. There was pity in it, but amusement too. The emotion, though she did not recognize it, was maternal. Mothers, listening to their children pleading with engaging absurdity for something wholly out of their power to bestow, feel that same wavering between tears and laughter. Sally wanted to pick Ginger up and kiss him. The one thing she could not do was to look on him, sorry as she was for him, as a reasonable grown-up man. "You don't really mean it, you know." "Don't I?" said Ginger hollowly. "Oh, don't I?" "You can't. There isn't such a thing in real life as love at first sight. Love's a thing that comes when you know a person well and—" She paused. It had just occurred to her that she was hardly the girl to lecture in this strain. Her love for Gerald Foster had been sufficiently sudden, even instantaneous. What did she know of Gerald except that she loved him? They had become engaged within 2 weeks of their first meeting. She found this recollection damping to her eloquence, and ended by saying tamely, "It's ridiculous." Ginger had simmered down to a mood of melancholy resignation. "I couldn't have expected you to care for me, I suppose, anyway," he said sombrely. "I'm not much of a chap." It was just the diversion from the theme under discussion which Sally had been longing to find. She welcomed the chance of continuing the conversation on a less intimate and sentimental note. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about," she said, seizing the opportunity offered by this display of humility. "I've been looking for you all day to go on with what I was starting to say in the lift last night when we were interrupted. Do you mind if I talk to you like an aunt, or a sister, suppose we say? Really, the best plan would be for you to adopt me as an honorary sister. What do you think?" Ginger did not appear noticeably elated at the suggested relationship. "Because I really do take a tremendous interest in you." Ginger brightened. "That's awfully good of you." "I'm going to speak words of wisdom. Ginger, why don't you brace up?" "Brace up?" "Yes, stiffen your backbone and stick out your chin and square your elbows and really amount to something. Why do you simply flop about and do nothing and leave everything to what you call the family? Why do you have to be helped all the time? Why don't you help yourself? Why do you have to have jobs found for you? Why don't you rush out and get one? Why do you have to worry about what the family thinks of you? Why don't you make yourself independent of them? I know you had hard luck, suddenly finding yourself without money and all that, but good heavens, everybody else in the world who has ever done anything has been broke at one time or another. It's part of the fun. You'll never get anywhere by letting yourself be picked up by the family like a floppy Newfoundland puppy and dumped down in any old place that happens to suit them. A job's a thing you've got to choose for yourself and get for yourself. Think what you can do, there must be something, and then go at it with a snort and grab it and hold it down and teach it to take a joke. You've managed to collect some money, it will give you time to look round, and when you've had a look round, do something. Try to realize you're alive, and try to imagine the family isn't." Sally stopped and drew a deep breath. Ginger Kemp did not reply for a moment. He seemed greatly impressed. "When you talk quick," he said at length in a serious, meditative voice, "your nose sort of goes all squiggly. Ripping, it looks." Sally uttered an indignant cry. "Do you mean to say you haven't been listening to a word I've been saying?" she demanded. "Oh, rather. Oh, by Jove, yes." "Well, what did I say?" And your eyes sort of shine, too." "Never mind my eyes. What did I say?" "You told me," said Ginger on reflection, "to get a job." "Well, yes. I put it much better than that, but that's what it amounted to, I suppose. All right, then. I'm glad you—" Ginger was eyeing her with mournful devotion. "I say," he interrupted, "I wish you'd let me write to you. Letters, I mean, and all that. I have an idea it would kind of buck me up." "You won't have time for writing letters." "I'll have time to write them to you. You haven't an address or anything of that sort in America, have you, by any chance? I mean, so that I'd know where to write to." "I can give you an address which will always find me." She told him the number and street of Mrs. Meecher's boarding-house, and he wrote them down reverently on his shirt-cuff. "Yes, on second thoughts, do write," she said. "Of course I shall want to know how you've got on. Oh, my goodness, that clock's not right." "Just about. What time does your train go?" "Go? It's gone, or at least it goes in about 2 seconds." She made a rush for the swing door, to the confusion of the uniformed official who had not been expecting this sudden activity. "Good-bye, Ginger. Write to me, and remember what I said." Ginger, alert after his unexpected fashion when it came to a question of physical action, had followed her through the swing door, and they emerged together and started running down the square. "Stick it," said Ginger encouragingly. He was running easily and well, as becomes a man who, in his day, had been a snip for his international at scrum-half. Sally saved her breath. The train was beginning to move slowly out of the station as they sprinted abreast onto the platform. Ginger dived for the nearest door, wrenched it open, gathered Sally neatly in his arms, and flung her in. She landed squarely on the toes of a man who occupied the corner seat, and, bounding off again, made for the window. Ginger, faithful to the last, was trotting beside the train as it gathered speed. "Ginger! My poor porter! Tip him! I forgot!" "Right-ho!" "And don't forget what I've been saying." "Right-ho!" "Look after yourself, and death to the family." "Right-ho!" The train passed smoothly out of the station. Sally cast one last look back at her red-haired friend, who had now halted and was waving a handkerchief. Then she turned to apologize to the other occupant of the carriage. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly. "I hope I didn't hurt you." She found herself facing Ginger's cousin, the dark man of yesterday's episode on the beach, Bruce Carmyle. 3. Mr. Carmyle was not a man who readily allowed himself to be disturbed by life's little surprises, but at the present moment he could not help feeling slightly dazed. He recognized Sally now as the French girl who had attracted his cousin Lancelot's notice on the beach. At least, he had assumed that she was French, and it was startling to be addressed by her now in fluent English. How had she suddenly acquired this gift of tongues, and how on earth had she had time since yesterday, when he had been a total stranger to her, to become sufficiently intimate with cousin Lancelot to be sprinting with him down station platforms and addressing him out of railway carriage windows as Ginger? Bruce Carmyle was aware that most members of that subspecies of humanity, his cousin's personal friends, called him by that familiar, and, so Carmyle held, vulgar, nickname, but how had this girl got hold of it? If Sally had been less pretty, Mr. Carmyle would undoubtedly have looked disapprovingly at her, for she had given his rather rigid sense of the proprieties a nasty jar. But as, panting and flushed from her run, she was prettier than any girl he had yet met, he contrived to smile. "Not at all," he said in answer to her question, though it was far from the truth. His left big toe was aching confoundedly. Even a girl with a foot as small as Sally's can make her presence felt on a man's toe, if the scrum-half who is handling her aims well and uses plenty of vigour. "If you don't mind," said Sally, sitting down, "I think I'll breathe a little." She breathed. The train sped on. "Quite a close thing," said Bruce Carmyle affably. The pain in his toe was diminishing. "You nearly missed it." "Yes, it was lucky Mr. Kemp was with me. He throws very straight, doesn't he?" "Tell me," said Carmyle, "how do you come to know my cousin? On the beach yesterday morning—" "Oh, we didn't know each other then, but we were staying at the same hotel, and we spent an hour or so shut up in an elevator together. That was when we really got acquainted." A waiter entered the compartment, announcing in unexpected English that dinner was served in the restaurant car. "Would you care for dinner?" "I'm starving," said Sally. She reproved herself, as they made their way down the corridor, for being so foolish as to judge anyone by his appearance. This man was perfectly pleasant in spite of his grim exterior. She had decided by the time they had seated themselves at the table she liked him. At the table, however, Mr. Carmyle's manner changed for the worse. He lost his amiability. He was evidently a man who took his meals seriously, and believed in treating waiters with severity. He shuddered austerely at a stain on the tablecloth, and then concentrated himself frowningly on the bill of fare. Sally, meanwhile, was establishing cosy relations with the much too friendly waiter, a cheerful old man who from the start seemed to have made up his mind to regard her as a favourite daughter. The waiter talked no English, and Sally no French, but they were getting along capitally, when Mr. Carmyle, who had been irritably waving aside the servitor's light-hearted advice (at the Hôtel Splendide the waiters never bent over you and breathed cordial suggestions down the side of your face), gave his order crisply in the Anglo-Gallic dialect of the travelling Briton. The waiter remarked "Boum" in a pleased sort of way, and vanished. "Nice old man," said Sally. "Infernally familiar," said Mr. Carmyle. Sally perceived that on the topic of the waiter she and her host did not see eye to eye, and that little pleasure or profit could be derived from any discussion centering about him. She changed the subject. She was not liking Mr. Carmyle quite so much as she had done a few minutes ago, but it was courteous of him to give her dinner, and she tried to like him as much as she could. "By the way," she said, "my name is Nicholas. I always think it's a good thing to start with names, don't you?" "Mine?" "Oh, I know yours. Ginger, Mr. Kemp told me." Mr. Carmyle, who since the waiter's departure had been thawing, stiffened again at the mention of Ginger. "Indeed," he said coldly. "Apparently you got intimate." Sally did not like his tone. He seemed to be criticizing her, and she resented criticism from a stranger. Her eyes opened wide, and she looked dangerously across the table. "Why, apparently. I told you that we had got intimate, and I explained how. You can't stay shut up in an elevator half the night with anybody without getting to know him. I found Mr. Kemp very pleasant." "Really?" "And very interesting." Mr. Carmyle raised his eyebrows. "Would you call him interesting?" "I did call him interesting." Sally was beginning to feel the exhilaration of battle. Men usually made themselves extremely agreeable to her, and she reacted belligerently under the stiff unfriendliness which had come over her companion in the last few minutes. "He told me all about himself." "And you found that interesting?" "Why not?" "Well..." A frigid half-smile came and went on Bruce Carmyle's dark face. "My cousin has many excellent qualities, no doubt. He used to play football well, and I understand that he is a capable amateur pugilist. But I should not have supposed him entertaining. We find him a little dull." "I thought it was only royalty that called themselves we." "I meant myself, and the rest of the family." The mention of the family was too much for Sally. She had to stop talking in order to allow her mind to clear itself of rude thoughts. "Mr. Kemp was telling me about Mr. Scrymgeour," she went on at length. Bruce Carmyle stared for a moment at the yard or so of French bread which the waiter had placed on the table. "Indeed," he said. "He has an engaging lack of reticence." The waiter returned bearing soup and dumped it down. "V'la," he observed, with the satisfied air of a man who has successfully performed a difficult conjuring trick. He smiled at Sally expectantly, as though confident of applause from this section of his audience at least, but Sally's face was set and rigid. She had been snubbed, and the sensation was as pleasant as it was novel. "I think Mr. Kemp had hard luck," she said. "If you will excuse me, I would prefer not to discuss the matter." Mr. Carmyle's attitude was that Sally might be a pretty girl, but she was a stranger, and the intimate affairs of the family were not to be discussed with strangers, however prepossessing. "He was quite in the right. Mr. Scrymgeour was beating a dog." "I've heard the details." "Oh, I didn't know that. Well, don't you agree with me, then?" "I do not. A man who would throw away an excellent position simply because..." "Oh, well, if that's your view, I suppose it is useless to talk about it." "Quite." "Still, there's no harm in asking what you propose to do about Mr. Kemp." Mr. Carmyle became more glacial. "I'm afraid I cannot discuss—" Sally's quick impatience, nobly restrained till now, finally got the better of her. "Oh, for goodness' sake," she snapped, "do try to be human, and don't always be snubbing people. You remind me of one of those portraits of men in the 18th century with wooden faces, who look out of heavy gold frames at you with fishy eyes, as if you were a regrettable incident." "Roast beef," said the waiter genially, manifesting himself suddenly beside them as if he had popped up out of a trap. Bruce Carmyle attacked his roast beef morosely. Sally, who was in the mood when she knew that she would be ashamed of herself later on, but was full of battle at the moment, sat in silence. "I am sorry," said Mr. Carmyle ponderously, "if my eyes are fishy. The fact has not been called to my attention before." "I suppose you never had any sisters," said Sally. "They would have told you." Mr. Carmyle relapsed into an offended dumbness, which lasted till the waiter had brought the coffee. "I think," said Sally, getting up, "I'll be going now. I don't seem to want any coffee, and, if I stay on, I may say something rude. I thought I might be able to put in a good word for Mr. Kemp and save him from being massacred, but apparently it's no use. Good-bye, Mr. Carmyle, and thank you for giving me dinner." She made her way down the car, followed by Bruce Carmyle's indignant yet fascinated gaze. Strange emotions were stirring in Mr. Carmyle's bosom. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Ginger in a dangerous mood. Some few days later, owing to the fact that the latter, being preoccupied, did not see him first, Bruce Carmyle met his cousin Lancelot in Piccadilly. They had returned by different routes from Roville, and Ginger would have preferred the separation to continue. He was hurrying on with a nod when Carmyle stopped him. "Just the man I wanted to see," he observed. "Oh, hullo," said Ginger, without joy. "I was thinking of calling at your club." "Yes?" "Yes. Cigarette?" Ginger peered at the proffered case with the vague suspicion of the man who has allowed himself to be lured on to the platform and is accepting a card from the conjurer. He felt bewildered. In all the years of their acquaintance he could not recall another such exhibition of geniality on his cousin's part. He was surprised indeed at Mr. Carmyle's speaking to him at all, for the affaire Scrymgeour remained an unhealed wound, and the family, Ginger knew, were even now in session upon it. "Been back in London long?" "Day or two." "I heard quite by accident that you had returned and that you were staying at the club. By the way, thank you for introducing me to Miss Nicholas." Ginger started violently. "What?" "I was in that compartment, you know, at Roville Station. You threw her right on top of me. We agreed to consider that an introduction. An attractive girl." Bruce Carmyle had not entirely made up his mind regarding Sally, but on one point he was clear, that she should not, if he could help it, pass out of his life. Her abrupt departure had left him with that baffled and dissatisfied feeling which, though it has little in common with love at first sight, frequently produces the same effects. She had had, he could not disguise it from himself, the better of their late encounter, and he was conscious of a desire to meet her again and show her that there was more in him than she apparently supposed. Bruce Carmyle, in a word, was piqued, and, though he could not quite decide whether he liked or disliked Sally, he was very sure that a future without her would have an element of flatness. "A very attractive girl. We had a very pleasant talk." "I bet you did," said Ginger enviously. "By the way, she did not give you her address by any chance?" "Why?" said Ginger suspiciously. His attitude towards Sally's address resembled somewhat that of a connoisseur who has acquired a unique work of art. He wanted to keep it to himself and gloat over it. "Well, I promised to send her some books she was anxious to read." "I shouldn't think she gets much time for reading." "Books which are not published in America." "Oh, pretty nearly everything is published in America, what? Bound to be, I mean." "Well, these particular books are not," said Mr. Carmyle shortly. He was finding Ginger's reserve a little trying, and wished that he had been more inventive. "Give them to me, and I'll send them to her," suggested Ginger. "Good Lord, man," snapped Mr. Carmyle, "I'm capable of sending a few books to America. Where does she live?" Ginger revealed the sacred number of the Holy Street which had the luck to be Sally's headquarters. He did it because with a persistent devil like his cousin there seemed no way of getting out of it, but he did it grudgingly. "Thanks." Bruce Carmyle wrote the information down with a gold pencil in a dapper little morocco-bound notebook. He was the sort of man who always has a pencil, and the backs of old envelopes never enter into his life. There was a pause. Bruce Carmyle coughed. "I saw Uncle Donald this morning," he said. His manner had lost its geniality. There was no need for it now, and he was a man who objected to waste. He spoke coldly, and in his voice there was a familiar subtingle of reproof. "Yes," said Ginger moodily. This was the uncle in whose office he had made his debut as a hasher, a worthy man, highly respected in the National Liberal Club, but never a favourite of Ginger's. There were other minor uncles and a few subsidiary aunts who went to make up the family, but Uncle Donald was unquestionably the managing director of that body, and it was Ginger's considered opinion that in this capacity he approximated to a human blister. "He wants you to dine with him tonight at Bleak's." Ginger's depression deepened. A dinner with Uncle Donald would hardly have been a cheerful function, even in the surroundings of a banquet in the Arabian Nights. There was that about Uncle Donald's personality which would have cast a sobering influence over the orgies of the Emperor Tiberius at Capri. To dine with him at a morgue like that relic of old London, Bleak's Coffee-house, which confined its custom principally to regular patrons who had not missed an evening there for half a century, was to touch something very near bedrock. Ginger was extremely doubtful whether flesh and blood were equal to it. "Tonight?" he said. "Oh, you mean tonight? Well—" "Don't be a fool. You know as well as I do that you've got to go." Uncle Donald's invitations were royal commands in the family. "If you've another engagement, you must put it off." "Oh, all right." 7:30 sharp." "All right," said Ginger gloomily. The two men went their ways, Bruce Carmyle eastwards because he had clients to see in his chambers at the Temple, Ginger westwards because Mr. Carmyle had gone east. There was little sympathy between these cousins, yet oddly enough their thoughts, as they walked, centred on the same object. Bruce Carmyle, threading his way briskly through the crowds of Piccadilly Circus, was thinking of Sally, and so was Ginger as he loafed aimlessly towards Hyde Park Corner, bumping in a sort of coma from pedestrian to pedestrian. Since his return to London, Ginger had been in bad shape. He mooned through the days and slept poorly at night. If there is one thing rottener than another in a pretty blighted world, one thing which gives a fellow the pip and reduces him to the condition of an absolute onion, it is hopeless love. Hopeless love had got Ginger all stirred up. His had been hitherto a placid soul. Even the financial crash which had so altered his life had not bruised him very deeply. His temperament had enabled him to bear the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune with a philosophic "right-ho." But now everything seemed different. Things irritated him acutely which before he had accepted as inevitable. His Uncle Donald's moustache, for instance, and its owner's habit of employing it during meals as a sort of zareba or earthwork against the assaults of soup. "By gad," thought Ginger, stopping suddenly opposite Devonshire House, "if he uses that damned shrubbery as soup-strainer tonight, I'll slosh him with a fork." Hard thoughts, and getting harder all the time, for nothing grows more quickly than a mood of rebellion. Rebellion is a forest fire that flames across the soul. The spark had been lighted in Ginger, and long before he reached Hyde Park Corner he was ablaze and crackling. By the time he returned to his club he was practically a menace to society. to that section of it, at any rate, which embraced his Uncle Donald, his minor uncles George and William, and his aunts Mary, Geraldine, and Louise. Nor had the mood passed when he began to dress for the dismal festivities of Bleak's coffee-house. He scowled as he struggled morosely with an obstinate tie. One cannot disguise the fact. Ginger was warming up, and it was just at this moment that fate, as though it had been waiting for the psychological instant, applied the finishing touch. There was a knock at the door, and a waiter came in with a telegram. Ginger looked at the envelope. It had been readdressed and forwarded on from the Hotel Normandy. It was a wireless, handed in on board the White Star liner Olympic, and it ran as follows: "Remember, death to the family. S." Ginger sat down heavily on the bed. The driver of the taxicab which at 25 minutes past 7 drew up at the dingy door of Bleak's coffee-house in the Strand was rather struck by his fare's manner and appearance. "A determined-looking sort of young bloke," was the taxi-driver's verdict. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Sally Hears News. It had been Sally's intention, on arriving in New York, to take a room at the St. Regis and revel in the gilded luxury to which her wealth entitled her before moving into the small but comfortable apartment which, as soon as she had the time, she intended to find and make her permanent abode. But when the moment came and she was giving directions to the taxi-driver at the dock, there seemed to her something revoltingly Fillmorian about the scheme. It would be time enough to sever herself from the boarding-house which had been her home for 3 years when she had found the apartment. Meanwhile, the decent thing to do, if she did not want to brand herself in the sight of her conscience as a female Fillmore, was to go back temporarily to Mrs. Meecher's admirable establishment and foregather with her old friends. After all, home is where the heart is, even if there are more prunes there than the gourmet would consider judicious. Perhaps it was the unavoidable complacency induced by the thought that she was doing the right thing, or perhaps it was the tingling expectation of meeting Gerald Foster again after all these weeks of separation, that made the familiar streets seem wonderfully bright as she drove through them. It was a perfect, crisp New York morning, all blue sky and amber sunshine, and even the ash-cans had a stimulating look about them. The streetcars were full of happy people rollicking off to work. Policemen directed the traffic with jaunty affability, and the white-clad street-cleaners went about their poetic tasks with a quiet but none the less noticeable relish. It was improbable that any of these people knew that she was back, but somehow they all seemed to be behaving as though this were a special day. The first discordant note in this overture of happiness was struck by Mrs. Meecher, who informed Sally, after expressing her gratification at the news that she required her old room, that Gerald Foster had left town that morning. "Gone to Detroit, he has," said Mrs. Meecher. "Miss Doland, too." She broke off to speak a caustic word to the boarding-house handyman, who, with Sally's trunk as a weapon, was depreciating the value of the wallpaper in the hall. "There's that play of his being tried out there, you know, Monday," resumed Mrs. Meecher, after the handyman had bumped his way up the staircase. "They been rehearsing ever since you left." Sally was disappointed, but it was such a beautiful morning, and New York was so wonderful after the dull voyage in the liner, that she was not going to allow herself to be depressed without good reason. After all, she could go on to Detroit tomorrow. It was nice to have something to which she could look forward. "Oh, is Elsa in the company?" she said. "Sure, and very good, too, I hear." Mrs. Meecher kept abreast of theatrical gossip. She was an ex-member of the profession herself, having been in the first production of Florodora, though, unlike everybody else, not one of the original sextet. "Mr. Fawcett was down to see a rehearsal, and he said Miss Doland was fine, and he's not easy to please, as you know." "How is Mr. Fawcett?" Mrs. Meecher, not unwillingly, for she was a woman who enjoyed the tragedies of life, made her second essay in the direction of lowering Sally's uplifted mood. "Poor old gentleman, he ain't over and above well. Went to bed early last night with a headache, and this morning I been to see him, and he don't look well. There's a lot of this Spanish influenza about. It might be that. Lots of people have been dying of it, if you believe what you see in the papers," said Mrs. Meecher buoyantly. "Good gracious! You don't think—" "Well, he ain't turned black," admitted Mrs. Meecher with regret. "They say they turn black. If you believe what you see in the papers, that is. Of course, that may come later," she added, with the air of one confident that all will come right in the future. "The doctor'll be in to see him pretty soon. He's quite happy. Toto's sitting with him." Sally's concern increased. Like everyone who had ever spent any length of time in the house, she had strong views on Toto. This quadruped, who stained the fame of the entire canine race by posing as a dog, was a small woolly animal with a persistent and penetrating yap, hard to bear with equanimity in health, and certainly quite outside the range of a sick man. Her heart bled for Mr. Faucitt. Mrs. Meecher, on the other hand, who held a faith in her little pet's amiability and power to soothe which 7 years' close association had been unable to shake, seemed to feel that, with Toto on the spot, all that could be done had been done, as far as pampering the invalid was concerned. "I must go up and see him," cried Sally. "Poor old dear!" "Sure, you know his room. You can hear Toto talking to him now," said Mrs. Meecher complacently. "He wants a cracker, that's what he wants. Toto likes a cracker after breakfast." The invalid's eyes, as Sally entered the room, turned wearily to the door. At the sight of Sally they lit up with an incredulous rapture. Almost any intervention would have pleased Mr. Faucitt at that moment, for his little playmate had long outstayed any welcome that might originally have been his, but that the caller should be his beloved Sally seemed to the old man something in the nature of a return of the age of miracles. "Sally!" "One moment. Here, Toto!" Toto, struck momentarily dumb by the sight of food, had jumped off the bed and was standing with his head on one side, peering questioningly at the cracker. He was a suspicious dog, but he allowed himself to be lured into the passage, upon which Sally threw the cracker down and slipped in and shut the door. Toto, after a couple of yaps, which may have been gratitude or baffled fury, trotted off downstairs, and Mr. Faucitt drew a deep breath. "Sally, you come as ever as an angel of mercy. Our worthy Mrs. Meecher means well, and I yield to no man in my respect for her innate kindness of heart, but she errs in supposing that that thrice-damned whelp of hers is a combination of sick nurse, soothing medicine, and a week at the seaside. She insisted on bringing him here. He was yapping then, as he was yapping when, with womanly resource which I cannot sufficiently praise, you decoyed him hence, and each yap went through me like hammer-strokes on sheeted tin. Sally, you stand alone among womankind. You shine like a good deed in a naughty world. When did you get back?" "I've only just arrived in my hired barouche from the pier." "And you came to see your old friend without delay? I am grateful and flattered, Sally, my dear." "Of course I came to see you. Do you suppose that, when Mrs. Meecher told me you were sick, I just said, 'Is that so?' and went on talking about the weather? Well, what do you mean by it? Frightening everybody. Poor old darling, do you feel very bad?" 1,000 individual mice are nibbling the base of my spine, and I am conscious of a constant need of cooling refreshment. But what of that? Your presence is a tonic. Tell me, how did our Sally enjoy foreign travel?" "Our Sally had the time of her life." "Did you visit England?" "Only passing through." "How did it look?" asked Mr. Faucitt eagerly. "Moist. Very moist." "It would," said Mr. Faucitt indulgently. "I confess that, happy as I have been in this country, there are times when I miss those wonderful London days, when a sort of cosy brown mist hangs over the streets, and the pavements ooze with a perspiration of mud and water, and you see through the haze the yellow glow of the bodega lamps shining in the distance like harbour lights. Not," said Mr. Faucitt, "that I specify the bodega to the exclusion of other and equally worthy hostelries." I have passed just as pleasant hours in rules and shorts. You missed something by not lingering in England, Sally." "I know I did. Pneumonia." Mr. Faucitt shook his head reproachfully. "You are prejudiced, my dear. You would have enjoyed London if you had had the courage to brave its superficial gloom. Where did you spend your holiday? Paris?" "Part of the time, and the rest of the while I was down by the sea. It was glorious. I don't think I would ever have come back if I hadn't had to. But of course I wanted to see you all again, and I wanted to be at the opening of Mr. Foster's play. Mrs. Meecher tells me you went to one of the rehearsals." "I attended a dog-fight, which I was informed was a rehearsal," said Mr. Faucitt severely. "There is no rehearsing nowadays." "Oh dear, was it as bad as all that?" "The play is good. The play, I will go further, is excellent. It has fat. But the acting—" "Mrs. Meecher said you told her that Elsa was good." "Our worthy hostess did not misreport me. Miss Doland has great possibilities. She reminds me somewhat of Matilda Devine, under whose banner I played a season at the Old Royalty in London many years ago. She has the seeds of greatness in her, but she is wasted in the present case on an insignificant part. There is only one part in the play. I allude to the one murdered by Miss Mabel Hobson." "Murdered?" Sally's heart sank. She had been afraid of this, and it was no satisfaction to feel that she had warned Gerald. "Is she very terrible?" "She has the face of an angel, and the histrionic ability of that curious suet pudding which our estimable Mrs. Meecher is apt to give us on Fridays. In my professional career I have seen many cases of what I may term the lady friend in the role of star, but Miss Hobson eclipses them all. I remember in the year '94 a certain scion of the plutocracy took it into his head to present a female, for whom he had conceived an admiration, in a part which would have taxed the resources of the ablest. I was engaged in her support, and at the first rehearsal I recollect saying to my dear old friend Arthur Mosby, dead, alas, these many years, an excellent juvenile, but, like so many good fellows, cursed with a tendency to lift the elbow, I recollect saying to him, 'Arthur, dear boy, I give it 2 weeks.' 'Max,' was his reply, 'you are an incurable optimist. 1 consecutive night, laddie, 1 consecutive night.' We had, I recall, an even half-crown upon it. He won. We opened at Wigan, our leading lady got the bird, and the show closed next day. I was forcibly reminded of this incident as I watched Miss Hobson rehearsing." "Oh, poor Mr. Foster!" "I do not share your commiseration for that young man," said Mr. Faucitt austerely. "You probably are almost a stranger to him, but he and I have been thrown together a good deal of late. A young man upon whom, mark my words, success, if it ever comes, will have the worst effects. I dislike him, Sally. He is, I think, without exception, the most selfish and self-centred young man of my acquaintance. He reminds me very much of old Billy Fothergill, with whom I toured a good deal in the later '80s. Did I ever tell you the story of Billy and the amateur who—" Sally was in no mood to listen to the adventures of Mr. Fothergill. The old man's innocent criticism of Gerald had stabbed her deeply. A momentary impulse to speak hotly in his defence died away as she saw Mr. Faucitt's pale, worn old face. He had meant no harm, after all. How could he know what Gerald was to her? She changed the conversation abruptly. "Have you seen anything of Fillmore while I've been away?" "Fillmore? Why, yes, my dear. Curiously enough, I happened to run into him on Broadway only a few days ago. He seemed changed, less stiff and aloof than he had been for some time past. I may be wronging him, but there have been times of late when one might almost have fancied him a trifle upstage. All that was gone at our last encounter. He appeared glad to see me, and was most cordial." Sally found her composure restored. Her lecture on the night of the party had evidently, she thought, not been wasted. Mr. Faucitt, however, advanced another theory to account for the change in the man of destiny. "I rather fancy," he said, "that the softening influence has been the young man's fiancée." "What? Fillmore's not engaged?" "Did he not write and tell you? I suppose he was waiting to inform you when you returned. Yes, Fillmore is betrothed. The lady was with him when we met. A Miss Winch. In the profession, I understand. He introduced me. A very charming and sensible young lady, I thought." Sally shook her head. "She can't be. Fillmore would never have got engaged to anyone like that. Was her hair crimson?" "Brown, if I recollect rightly." "Very loud, I suppose, and overdressed?" "On the contrary, neat and quiet." "You've made a mistake," said Sally decidedly. "She can't have been like that. I shall have to look into this. It does seem hard that I can't go away for a few weeks without all my friends taking to beds of sickness and all my brothers getting ensnared by vampires." A knock at the door interrupted her complaint. Mrs. Meecher entered, ushering in a pleasant little man with spectacles and a black bag. "The doctor to see you, Mr. Faucitt." Mrs. Meecher cast an appraising eye at the invalid, as if to detect symptoms of approaching discoloration. "I've been telling him that what I think you've gotten is this here new Spanish influenza. 2 more deaths there were in the paper this morning, if you can believe what you see." "I wonder," said the doctor, "if you would mind going and bringing me a small glass of water." "Why, sure." "Not a large glass, a small glass. Just let the tap run for a few moments, and take care not to spill any as you come up the stairs." "I always ask ladies like our friend who has just gone," he added as the door closed, "to bring me a glass of water. It keeps them amused and interested and gets them out of the way, and they think I am going to do a conjuring trick with it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to drink it. Now let's have a look at you." The examination did not take long. At the end of it, the doctor seemed somewhat chagrined. "Our good friend's diagnosis was correct. I'd give a leg to say it wasn't, but it was. It is this here new Spanish influenza. Not a bad attack. You want to stay in bed and keep warm, and I'll write you out a prescription. You ought to be nursed. Is this young lady a nurse?" No, merely—" "Of course I'm a nurse," said Sally decidedly. "It isn't difficult, is it, doctor? I know nurses smooth pillows. I can do that. Is there anything else?" "Their principal duty is to sit here and prevent the excellent and garrulous lady who has just left us from getting in. They must also be able to aim straight with a book or an old shoe if that small woolly dog I met downstairs tries to force an entrance. If you are equal to these tasks, I can leave the case in your hands with every confidence." "But Sally, my dear," said Mr. Faucitt, concerned, "you must not waste your time looking after me. You have 1,000 things to occupy you." "There's nothing I want to do more than help you to get better. I'll just go out and send a wire, and then I'll be right back." 5 minutes later, Sally was in a Western Union office, telegraphing to Gerald that she would be unable to reach Detroit in time for the opening. End of chapter 5.